Warm applause for Jeff Warren.
Thank you, guys. I feel like I do have something that's very uplifting to say, but it's also critical in some places, but it comes out of my admiration for this genre and these books, having read a lot of them. And actually, one of the things I want to do is explore why I think they're so magical when they work and what's happening, and then also a little bit about how they might be able to become more effective, because I think that these books are really healing. And right now, unfortunately, they don't reach a lot of people because of the really absolutist stance that they take, which is also, there's a reason for that. And so we'll get into this. But it'll be interesting because afterwards, we're going to have a panel that's going to address some of my issues. It's going to be called Filling in the Details. And I'll be joined by three different folks who will be talking about their experience, including Tim, who you just met, Gary and Lisa, and they'll be talking about their experience of non-duality. And the idea is to kind of try to get a little bit more of an understanding of what's happening, more detail, more, including some of the challenging parts, not just the sort of beatific story. So this talk is a little slightly different. It's sort of about books, it's about writing, and it's about, I guess, some of the challenges of communicating the non-dual experience. So when Maurizio first asked me to present a talk here, I wasn't sure what it was that I would be offering you guys, because I actually don't consider myself in any way non-dual. I still very much identify with my own separateness. I'm still trapped in suffering and spieling and questioning and seeking, and I'm fixated on various ideas, and then I get ADD and I forget about them. So in that sense, maybe I'm a little non-dual. But then I realized that actually I do abide full-time in the recognition of something, and that is I abide full-time in the recognition of my own writerly neurosis. However unconscious I may be in great swaths of my life, I am at least partially awake to the reality of being a professional writer. That's what I do. And a big part of being a writer is knowing how to get people to relate to your experience. So I love this picture here. Writing, good writing when it works, it creates a relationship between the writer and the reader. And this relationship can be very healing, especially in the case of spiritual books, which, if they're done well, can help to unfix you from your sort of more limited perspective and limited concerns and connect you to a much larger holding space, a much larger perspective, a much larger sense of connection. And this is part of our inheritance, and that's why I think a lot of us are here to try to understand what non-duality is. It's sort of one of the main things that keeps coming up, is that it is possible to occupy a space in life where you're connected to that ground in a more profound way. So in that sense, these books may be some of the most important books that we have, because when they are done well, they can really help to reduce people's suffering. Unfortunately, there's a problem. Well, some people will see it as a problem. Because I'm totally non-dual, I see it as a problem because I'm fixated on trying to make things better. And the problem is that these books are often very inaccessible. So right now, they only speak to a very small number of people. This is just true. I mean, I read these books, I love them, I try to get my humanities friends to read them, and they're like, they just send them flying. I remember reading a review in Time magazine of Eckhart Tolle's The Power of Now. And the reviewer was furious. She hated the book. She called it spiritual mumbo jumbo. I mean, she was profoundly offended by the book. Now, whatever you think of that book, it's pretty boilerplate, non-dual text. I mean, it's a good book. There's nothing particularly special about it. What was special, however, was that it was a unique opportunity to reach a very large mainstream audience with that message that was basically squandered, not by Eckhart Tolle, but by the reviewer, who was totally unable to enter into the non-dual perspective. It made her feel grappling with stuff she didn't understand, made her feel stupid. It made her feel alienated. It made her feel, defensive, and that came out in the review. So this is interesting to me. As I said, I am attached to the idea that we can do this better, that these books can still contain their non-dual truths, but that they can do so in a way that's more skillful and thus help bring more people into this perspective. So I think there's an opportunity here, and that's what this talk's going to be about. To borrow a wonderful phrase from Suzuki Roshi, when it comes to the non-dual book, yes, everything is perfect, but there's always room for improvement. So the question is, if it really is healing this perspective, how can we make it more accessible? So I'm going to kind of go through a few principles from the world of writing that I think could help. But I'll start with kind of talking about a couple of principles that I've sort of discerned from just reading non-dual books about how they already work. Because it's kind of magical how they work. In fact, I should just maybe do a little poll. How many people here have read, some of those, there's a kind of collage at the beginning, but have read a non-dual text, like an Eckhart Tolle or Gary Weber? Okay, so a lot of people. And how many people have found that in the reading of it, there was something healing in it? Okay, a lot. How many people found there was something kind of frustrating in it? A few, okay. So I'm not totally speaking to an empty audience, although it kind of does seem like that, considering most of the chairs are empty. So let's go to an actual case of a non-dual text. And I'll just talk personally from my experience. Like, I had been reading these books for quite a while, sort of banging my head against them, knowing that there was something really important here, and sometimes kind of getting it, but not really sure. And then probably about 10 years ago, I read a book by this guy. Anyone read this book, Coming Home by Lex Hickson? Oh my God, this book, you read it. This is a beautiful book. It's one of the most beautiful books written about the experience of the sacred, about non-duality. And he's an American Sufi writer. He's dead now. But he really speaks about this experience from many different traditions. And for me, I remember I was in my family cabin up north. I'm Canadian. I live in Toronto, but we have a cabin up in the Northlands. And it was sort of late at night, and I was sitting in my easy chair where I always read, and everyone was sleeping. So I could hear the sound of, my dad snoring in the other room, and I could hear the sound of the loons floating over the lake, and there's just a crackling fire, and that was sort of the scene. And here I am, I'm reading this book. And what was interesting about this book was the writing is so smooth. It's so authoritative in its own poetry, in its integrity, that I just felt really pulled into it. It was a vivid sensation. I remember feeling very much like I could follow him everywhere, that I trusted him. And so here I am, I'm kind of swimming inside the narrative, and Hickson is talking about Turiya in his last chapter. And Turiya is, as I'm sure many of you know, it's the Hindu word for the fourth, or the pure consciousness, the kind of ground. It's one of the many synonyms. And he's saying, he uses an analogy. He says, imagine a mathematical series of numbers. So I have a slide for this. Now, you don't have to follow along with this. I'm just giving this as an example. But he says, imagine a mathematical series of numbers. So we got 2, 4, 6, 8, 12. If we contemplate these numbers, Hickson writes in his book, he says, it'll dawn on us that there's a principle at work here, which we could use to generate the series indefinitely. And that principle, obviously, looking at that is, no surprise, it's +2. Yet nowhere in that series of numbers does it say +2. The series of numbers is just infused with it. It's what gives the whole sequence meaning. So this, he writes in his book, is how understanding of Turiya dawns. At first, as we look for Turiya, as we look for the non-dual experience, we imagine it's going to be just another experience, another number. But then something shifts, and we realize that it's not another number, another phenomenon, another experience. And in his words, the way he put it, he said, Turiya is not another number, it's the principle of the series. And so this description might leave you flat, but for whatever reason, as I'm sitting there in my easy chair and I'm flowing along with the argument, and suddenly I hit that phrase, Turiya is the principle of the series. And it was like, I don't know how many of you can relate to this, it was like the hackles suddenly went up on the back of my neck. And I realized that what's looking is the thing I'm looking for. Maybe that experience happened to you anytime reading a non-dual book. You're like, you kind of get this little vertigo feeling and you realize it's not, this is the thing they're talking about. And for me, it was a real sense of sort of spaciousness behind me, and like a kind of feeling of wanting to giggle, which is whenever now I read a non-dual book and I get one of those little shifts, I get this little giggly feeling, like it makes me kind of laugh, because there's an instant sort of lightness to something. It instantly just, there's like this dropping away, like you don't have to struggle, and there's this. So that I felt that same lightness. But what was interesting here is, those words may not work for you. They may work for you. You may read those exact words one time and nothing happens. But then another time you read it and all of a sudden, boom, for whatever reason, it creates an opening. Now that is very interesting. And there's actually a word for it in Zen. They call them turning words. So it's a deliberate strategy used in Zen. A koan is a turning word in a way. That even though the timing is sort of cosmic or karmic, like when it's well placed, this turning word in a sense, in a flow, in an argument, it just kind of breaks through those cognitive structures and reveals this deeper nature. So that's one thing. If we're talking about these books and how they work, one of them is that this two-part piece. One, that there's the use of turning words. Now, you can't be strategic about it because you never know when it's going to work, and they probably don't even know when they're writing it. It's just that at a certain point for you in your development, it's just going to hit you. But they need to be there. So there's the turning words, but then the other part of it is what I would call the dream part of it. And this is something that this guy talks about. Anybody know who this is? John Gardner? So John Gardner's not a spiritual guy. He's a kind of a very well-known guy in the world of writing. He wrote a very famous book called The Art of Fiction. He was a brilliant American writer. He died in a motorcycle accident, wrote in the 70s. He used to talk a lot about this. He talked about what he called the dream. And that was that fiction works, any good writing works, and this is the principle, the larger principle I'm pointing to. Any good writing works by creating a kind of gravity where the writing is so forceful, and it could be in speaking as well, that it kind of pulls you into the sensibility, and you're able to stay there, and you're able to kind of begin to experience the world through that. And in a sense, it's like a transmission. Writing works in the same way that Shaktipat works in spirituality. It's a kind of entrainment device that pulls you into perspective. Now, and the more frequently you make this visit, in the case of the non-dual books, the more enduring the shift. Now, what I think is very interesting about Lex Hickson's book and about the books by Gary Weber and by Rupert Spira is that they use the dream to wake you from the dream. They pull you into a particular current of their thinking, so you're following along, and then there's the turn, and it kind of pops out of it. So that you're using the dream as one of these technologies. So those are two things that are, I think, at work. But now I'm going to talk about some developments that I think could be introduced into some non-dual texts. These are just fine as they are, and they may be the only kind of books you want to read. But if you're interested in potentially reaching a larger demographic, we may begin to bring some of these other principles into it. So the most obvious one is the story. Basically, if you want to reach people, you have to start with where they are. You have to start on that side with the norm. And then you sort of leave this very careful trail of peanuts, over the bridge to the deviation, to the special case that you're talking about. If you don't do this, you're going to end up exactly, it's kind of the classic story or the classic mistake of the autodidact. The autodidact genius who's got some brilliant idea that's over here. It may, in fact, be the most brilliant understanding of quantum physics or the most brilliant new literary theory or whatever it is. But if you're unable to build a little trail of peanuts from the norm over to your brilliant idea, then no one's going to read your book. People are just going to get frustrated with it. They're not going to trust it. It seems inherently untrustworthy. I mean, this is a very obvious point I'm making. This is sort of an obvious lecture about things. But so in the case of non-duality, my thing would be, don't start from the full non-dual perspective. I mean, there is a part of us, yes, that can hear that. There's a part of us that will always recognize that. But why not use both? Why not start from where people are at and slowly tell the story of how it is that the shift happened for you? Even if it was suddenly, what happened in your life? Like, what did it feel like? The more we can use, you can use an argument to build a bridge, but a story is especially a personal story, is so much more effective and so much more profound. It's what really brings people in. And this is what I'm trying to say about books is that, whether people realize it or not, they're seeking a relationship with the writer. And this is a way to begin to create that relationship. So in the case of non-duality, tell the story and tell if you want and use details. And that's the next piece I was going to talk about. Not just any details. Sensualize and embody the details. Make it so we can feel it in our own body. This is something I write about a lot in animal consciousness. I write a lot about animal consciousness, and one of the things that's beginning to happen in the animal consciousness world is there's beginning to be an interest in academia and in popular literature in general, people trying to present looking at how we share bodies with other animals, that even though we can never know what it's entirely like to be another animal, if you get into their experience, if you get on the ground and sniff around, if you move, or you imagine undulating your back like a dolphin in the water, you can begin to get an intimation of some of that. Well, I would say that in a similar way, someone who's really truly operating from a profoundly non-dual perspective, in a way, even though it's relatable to you, because it's part of what your experience could be too, if you really want to relate to that animal, then that animal can begin to describe some of the things that are happening in their body. And I'll give you an example by this guy, Shinzen Young. He's been one of my teachers. And this is just a kind of trippy example, but I think it's funny. I've gone on lots of meditation retreats with Shinzen, and I know him well, and I have lots of conversations with him. And I often watch him in conversation. And I'm always struck by the way he always has that smile. He has this really huge smile on his face when people are talking to him. And his body language always seems kind of funny to me. And one day I asked him, I said, Shinzen, I notice when you're talking to people that you have this really funny smile on your face. And, what's going on with that? And he's like, and he laughed, and he said, oh yeah, it's because I'm doing my favorite meditation. And his favorite meditation is called See Out. So in Shinzen's experience, this is the thing about non-duality, is it gets experienced by different people in different ways. And in his experience, he has this real flexibility. He can look at somebody and experience them as a particle, or very fixated as just a static person. Or he can kind of shift his perspective and begin to experience them as a wave, as a flowing, vibrating field. And when he does that, he feels it in his body in a whole different way. He's smiling because basically I'm sitting there talking to him, going blah, blah, talking about some nerdy thing. He's actually probably not even really paying attention to what I'm saying. He's just getting like a Jeff massage for his eyeballs and his body. He's smiling, I'm just vibrating, dumping all this energy on him. He's just sitting there grooving out on it. So that's really fascinating to me. Like, I'd never heard that before. Like, this is how he experiences his non-duality in his body. Now, how interesting would it be to talk to other people who are from that perspective? Are there specific shifts like that for them? It may be that they experience the world exactly the same, but having interviewed dozens and dozens of people, and I can tell you there are all kinds of unusual and unique variations. And the more detail and specificness we can bring to that, the more relatable that exotic permutation, which is also not exotic, will become. So what does the wind feel like on your face? Whoa, that was interesting. With my non-dual moment of the talk. That kind of thing. So emphasizing sensual details. In the writing world, this is also known as show, don't tell. I mean, it's the classic rule of writing. You don't describe an experience. You show it happen. You embody it, and so people can feel it for themselves. It was actually the best critical review of I wrote a book called The Head Trip a few years ago about different states of consciousness. And it got generally good reviews, but this one University of Chicago reviewer was like, yeah, he's really great at the descriptions, but you know what? Like, what about the real flavors of being in those different states? And it was like, he hit the nerve. I mean, he definitely got it. Like, that was what that book was missing, and I tried to do that, but I really didn't put as much emphasis as I could on it. And so now, this is why I'm letting you guys learn from my mistakes, because maybe the book would have been better. Okay, so the next piece here, I'm going to have a little glass of water first. Hey, I'm curious, by the way, how many people here, maybe this is controversial to say or ask, but whatever. How many people here consider themselves to be fully embedded in a non-dual perspective? That is to say, not just having had a temporary glimpse in the back and temporary glimpse, but actually no longer feel themselves to be separate. No longer even feel that there's a doer inside. This is a very elevated stage of non-duality, but I'm curious, anyone, no, this is not me, anyone who wants to own up to it? How many people are willing to maybe, okay, some small fingers pointing very modestly. I know I don't mean to out you because I know it's like bad karma to brag and all that, or I mean, there's many reasons not to do it. But a few people, okay. Interesting. So here's the next piece. Close the dishonesty gap. This is the ideal versus the real. Now this is a kind of a nuanced point that I may be unable to make this point because it's so nuanced. I don't mean deliberate dishonesty. This is something that happens all the time to me as a writer. That I'm writing about some subject, and I go back and read what I wrote, and I realize that actually this isn't really what I think. It's only what I think I think. So without meaning to, I've sort of unintentionally subscribed to some ideal or some conventional understanding, and I'm writing from that place. This is why I consider writing a spiritual practice. Real writing is a constant inquiry into where you're being false, where you can be more honest. And again, it's not something you do deliberately. We gravitate to cliches when we speak, when we write, because they're like mental shortcuts. They help you communicate something more efficiently. But they often do so at the expense of a deeper honesty or a complexity or a specificity. So for me, there's a constant, in my writing, a constant going back and going, do I really think this? Is this what I really think? And often I find that actually no. And actually, one of the interesting things I find is whatever it is I'm struggling with in the writing is usually the real story. Like I might be struggling to try to write about something, and it's hard to write about this because it's nuanced or it's weird, and I'm trying to get the right wording for it. But actually, that struggle is what's interesting about what I'm trying to write about. And so then I just pan back the camera, and then I catch that. And it makes all the difference, because a reader knows when they're reading something that's honest, they can smell it. Like you can read a writer who's trying to be perfectly sanitized, and the books suck. You can just tell, it doesn't feel, but then you read a writer who's like, yeah, I'm a dick, I admit I'm a dick, these are all the ways I'm a dick, and they're just like open about being a dick. And you know what, you totally end up liking that and you get the message much more, because you believe it. So in the same way, with the non, this is, I mean, it's sort of a general term, but I wonder in some of these non-dual texts, is there a struggle that you're not relating? Is there a level in which you can drop down to be that much more truthful? And it's not because you're coming at it from some dishonesty, but it's for whatever reason, because you feel like this is not what should be in spiritual books, you go to the easy way of describing something. So it's just, a suggestion. And so there's also specifics about this, and that is about the parts of the story you're going to tell. I like this picture, it's sort of this guy floating in some great spiritual state, but he seems very alone as well. And I know this as well, having interviewed, dozens and dozens of practitioners and teachers, that spiritual development can be very tricky, that it goes through there can be lots of difficult periods that people pass through. And in fact, in Buddhism now, there's a lot more discussion about this. You're starting to see the self-disillusion process, or in popular vernacular, the dark night. So there's some researchers who are studying this. There's one at Brown University. There were some teachers coming out and starting to talk about it. But typically, I mean, first of all, you can't say typically. Everyone's case is totally different. But often, over the course of the spiritual development, there's a period where you have a breakthrough, and then there's this real reorientation that happens, like a reintegration. And it can be a real ungroundedness that can be very scary. And for some people, it's interpreted as a terrifying kind of emptiness. And I know people who are in this sort of limbo state that it's not stuff that you read in most spiritual texts. And yet, if you're to know that other people may be having these challenges or may have experienced that is an enormously huge service to it makes people feel like they're not alone, and actually can help normalize periods that are really difficult. So my point here is, like, emphasize the challenges as well. I mean, I'm sure a lot of teachers do this, and in some ways Buddhism has been really frank about this, because Buddhism is much more about a developmental process. Well, it depends which school, but as opposed to Advaita, which is sort of this instantaneous reorientation. In Buddhism, it's seen as being a developmental process where there's a slow moving away of pieces falling away. So you have people like Jack Kornfield. Have anyone read After the Ecstasy, the Laundry? Okay, it's a great book, and it's all about sort of this. After the ecstasy, the laundry, we get all the woo, mystical, awesome states of oneness, and then it's like shitstorm, the relationship falls apart, whatever. That's what the whole book's about that piece, and it's really sobering, and I think he's a good model. So another piece about this, so being honest about your own challenges, but also honest about, there also can be big awakenings, and then there's still certain really enduring habits, like neurotic habits that still stick around, or there could be real challenges that happen in your relationship. So that's also part of it. I'm not saying this would be relevant for every kind of non-dual book, but it sure would be refreshing for me. Can I get your question at the end? Okay, because I'm almost done. So this is the next piece is about relationships, about the need to emphasize relationships. Like, Non-duality alone, to me, is a lot less interesting than and less relatable than non-duality in relationship and what that actually looks like in relationship. So how have your relationships shifted because of this, because of your practice, because of where you find yourself? And I mean with your, your partner, your children, your kids, with nature. And I'll give you just an example so you know what I mean. I'm in addition to being a writer, I teach sort of introductory meditation to people. And as part of that, I'm part of a teachers forum with Shinzen. Shinzen's sort of been my main teacher. And different teachers post questions or challenges on the forum, and then we can read it and give each other feedback. So it's sort of a way to connect to a community. And one time I was sort of on there and I saw a post, and it's called Relationships After Awakening was the title of it. And I'll read you this post because I think it's kind of interesting. This is what the teacher writes. I'm working with this student who seems to have reached stream entry. Stream entry is in the Buddhist vernacular, it's what the term for initial enlightenment. So it's the first entering into the stream, your first big glimpse that leaves an enduring mark. I have no idea how these changes in Buddhism map onto the Advaita change. That's one of the things I'm trying to figure out, and I don't think they do map on, actually. But they do in some ways. But anyway, so this person seems to have reached stream entry, and she tells me that this has caused some friction in her relationship. Her boyfriend is knowledgeable about Buddhism and admits that he feels jealousy over what's happened to her. She asked me if there's anything she could do. She asked me if there's anything she could do. I pointed out that this is a big adjustment for him. Even if he gets past the jealousy issue, it's a radical change in relationship. Lots of relationships have some degree of clinginess in them, even relatively healthy ones. So even though she regards him with enormous love, it may not be in the same exact way as before. There must be an enormous amount of change in the subtle verbal and nonverbal communication in a relationship, in the emotional feedback, in the resonance. This was a huge change for her to adapt to, and she's got the advantage of no self. He's still working from a sense of separate self, which must feel threatened by the change. I imagine this is like the beginning of a new hilarious, like, Dear Non-Dual advice column, like, I find myself without a self, and yet it's really pissing off my pet cat. What can we do about this? Or I imagine, like, you ain't so enlightened, you can't take out the garbage. It's like a whole new relationship issues. So that's my little bit about relationships. Okay, here's my bit on, I was gonna call this slide, Don't Talk About Quantum Mechanics, which is just hilarious because it's been nonstop talk about quantum mechanics in this conference, and let me explain what I mean here. There's nothing wrong with talking about quantum mechanics. There is a challenge. There are particular challenges when you emphasize, when you focus on the interpretation of your experience versus what's just actually happening in your experience. So while it may be true that quantum mechanics reveals the connectivity between subject and object, and I don't doubt that, and there are huge things to learn, it's so overused that a lot of people just instantly will throw away the book as an overused New Age cliche. I mean, right now, unfortunately, quantum mechanics is almost a New Age cliche, which is hilarious. And this is especially true when it's delivered in a spirit of total certainty by someone who isn't a quantum mechanics, a quantum mechanics physicist. They're a dentist or they're a meditation teacher. That's where you're going to get people just going like, "What? Are you serious?" I mean, and my point is, unless you're an actual physicist, there is a trap that you see all the time in the New Age, which is trying to legitimize some unusual experience that you had by appealing to the authority of science, and it never works. Plus, as soon as you get into arguing about explanations, you're immediately in duality anyway. So you're betraying the whole non-dual perspective, which shouldn't need to fixate on the truth in any way. So, this is, to me, a really important point. Write about your experience. No one can argue with their experience. They can only argue with your interpretation of your experience. If you stick to the raw experience, what's actually happening, what you experience in your body, what you experience in relationship, you're in a much safer place than if you start to stretch out and talk about the holographic universe and this, that, and the other. You can talk about that stuff, but just be clear, you have to make the proper caveats. It seems like there are some parallels here. This may be superficial or it may be really profound, but just be careful when you're in that area because it instantly delegitimizes you to a wider audience. And that's kind of what the point of this talk is, can we make this stuff accessible to an intellectual mainstream? For me, that might really benefit from it. Okay, so in conclusion, what makes non-duality interesting to me is not the absolutist perspective, actually. It's how the absolutist perspective interacts with our real, actual, relativistic human lives, which are still embedded in a relative world with people in a relative perspective. And in this world, what really matters is our capacity to relate to other people and for them to relate to us. This honesty is the basis of genuine intimacy and connection. As my therapist explained to me one time, intimacy, Jeff, into me see. You have to actually show who you are, which was like a revelation and really made a big difference in a lot of my relationships. So I'll just end this on a personal note from a very non-dual person. Even though I'm very non-dual, I teach meditation, and sometimes I get students projecting onto me the ideals of how they think a teacher should be. And for the first little while, I didn't really realize this was happening. I didn't understand it was going on. And I would try to sort of inadvertently take on those projections. I tried to be perfect. I tried to just be I tried to be what I thought being spiritual was supposed to be. And I ended up feeling really lonely and isolated because the truth is I'm not enlightened, and I still depend very much on other people to feel connected. And I eventually figured out that there was no real relating going on with my students. I couldn't be anything less than my perfect self, and they didn't feel they could be either. And that's what absolute ideals do in a relative world. They basically fuck you up. They hold up an unrealistic standard that ends up making you feel bad about yourself, instead of accepting the full, complicated package of who you really are right here, right now. And that, to me, is the heart of non-duality, actually. So that's my talk. If you guys want to have any questions, you want to attack me, that's fine.